And as we come to this point of drawing some abiding lessons, I've asked Brigadier Eastwood to rejoin us because inevitably the logistic operations will be contributing to them. But first, perhaps, we should begin at the beginning, and I believe we'd all agree that the aspect of surprise is probably one of the most notable lessons. Here we had a situation in which Korea was politically but artificially divided, with the Soviet Union clearly providing also the military capability for the North to invade the South, yet in spite of some degree of watching of that situation, the North Koreans were able to spring a strategic and tactical surprise. There have been others since, but this was perhaps the first post-war, Anthony.
Yes. It certainly shows that they were able to mount a surprise offensive with conventional forces. I think there's a tendency by the other side, whoever they may be, to ignore or misread unpalatable facts that are coming through on the intelligence net.
This, after all, was one of the lessons that came out of the October 1973 situation, so far as the Israelis were concerned, as they themselves have very forthrightly acknowledged. The writing was on the wall, or some of the writing was on the wall, but they did not want to interpret what it said, and this could be said in part over Korea. I suppose there's rather an amusing aspect to this in a way from our point of view, in that the USSR also failed in this respect. It's strange, or it seems strange to me always, that there was that great fleet preparing in the United States on the western seaboard and to some extent in Japan to come up to Incheon, yet Russian intelligence was unable to pick that up and forewarn the North Koreans. So perhaps you might say that both sides ought to have learned a lesson on that.
Yes, and given the fact that MacArthur was the Supreme Commander, his track record of island hopping might have suggested he was going to try on a peninsula some sort of seaborne landing.
Yes. Well then, the danger of being complacent and ignoring the signs, the evident signs, in the case of an impending attack is something that ought to be in front of us always, and not expecting that we're going to have long periods of warning that an enemy may be about to spring upon us. Then the second lesson, as it seems to me, is the need to always be ready for the unexpected. Do we suppose that some planner arguing in, say, 1949 for the preparation of a force to go to the other side of the world and be engaged in mountain warfare in a country with which we had no treaty connections, with a phase of the seasons in subarctic temperatures, would have had any financial or indeed other support for his ideas? I guess he would have been ridiculed.
Well, you can add to that, of course, that had any member of the directing staff of the Staff College set an exercise based on some of the military situations, he'd have got the sack and had his head seen to.
Yes. A quick way to end a promising career. Be prepared for the unexpected. Then we come to the question of organizations. You know, in between wars, particularly as experience of war tends to grow dim and perhaps to vanish altogether, we have faddists proposing that organizations should be shaped to meet the plans for the first battle. That always seems to me to assume that the enemy knows what our rules are and is willing to play by them. Fortunately, we went to Korea with organizations tested by war. We went with the numbers, and here's a lesson on strengths, to give effect to those organizations so far as 29 Brigade was concerned, and indeed if you look at the situation of 27 Brigade, reduced forcibly to 3 companies, finding difficulty in getting reinforcements for their ad hoc organization, as compared with 29 Brigade, strong not only in infantry, but in its armoured regiment and in Sea Squadron 7 RTR, gunners, sappers, signals, arms and services. How much better off we were to withstand the accidents as well as the injuries and deaths on the battlefield. We were able to withstand them and continue fighting for a very long time. Organizationally, too, we were able to show that one needs to have strong units and perhaps one might say weak or anyway small headquarters. We hear now arguments that no tactical commander can look after more than 3 maneuver elements. What unutterable rubbish this is, as seen by the experience of war. Never mind World War II, though there is an ample number of examples there. But look at Korea again to add to that. General Brodie had under his command there, on numerous occasions, up to 6 maneuver elements. Mainly infantry, but often quite strong in armour, when you consider people like the Filipinos with their task organization and so on. So what we are really, I think, saying in terms of lessons on organization, have simple, well-tried organizations, make the units strong, let the headquarters be small. 29 Brigade headquarters had 14 officers, which we in the units thought were more than sufficient. But that actually is quite a small number if you consider that includes everybody right down to the brigade education officer, compared to some of the ideas which are put out now of the need for expanding always the staff, and inevitably it is at the expense of the fighting units, and in that I include their logistic elements with them. Anthony, I would guess you would think that we should refer to technical innovations which occurred, at least in a sub-phase, not quite as much as in World War II, but did occur as a result of the Korean War.
Yes, I'd put top of the list the use of helicopters. The Korean War was virtually the first war where they were effectively used, mainly for reconnaissance and communication, for rescuing pilots who'd been shot down, for observation posts for the artillery, and in case of emergency, for bringing in ammunition. When 45 Field Regiment in 3 days fired off about 25,000 rounds, and their mortars another 30,000, all that had to be brought in an emergency in helicopters. Now, these were all rather small helicopters, and people said, seeing these little helicopters go buzzing about over the hills, if they can go around the hills of Korea, surely we can get more helicopters and bigger helicopters. And so the United States in particular went into mass production. It was the French in Algeria who introduced the idea of the gunship. They met a lot of ground fire, rather accurate, and had to mount machine guns in their helicopters. And of course one saw the massive expansion in Vietnam, where the Americans at any one time had something like 3,500 helicopters in operation. And now we have helicopters as an anti-tank force in NATO.
Yes, I think that one wishes always that we'd had more and bigger helicopters in Korea. Life might not have been simpler, but it would have certainly given us greater scope for doing things against the type of enemy that we had there. And that brings me to also the logistic point because of the supply aspect. Boris, what would you say would be the principal abiding logistic lesson that we can draw from the operations in Korea?
I think I'd use 2 words which I've used before. One is KISS and the other is flexibility. KISS is keep it simple, stupid, and flexibility. And I would strongly suggest what we did learn was you don't want a logistic supremo commanding some vast or small logistic machine, inevitably being drawn into the detail that's going on in the front. What I think you want is what we've had for a long time and proven time and again, a series of interlocking and interdependent logistic agencies. But I would say the one right at the sharp end, second line if you like, must have the power and the ability to be able to react quickly to the tactical requirements of that formation.
And the third line, lying behind it, must inevitably conform to the requirements of the second line.
Absolutely.
General John Willoughby, you were a company commander through the heat and burden of 27 brigades, great days there. What remains with you?
Well, of course, the mass attacks, to the extent that they've experienced, was new. But the fact that the country was so mountainous and that the most flexible machine was, in fact, the ordinary soldier driving a pair of boots, this fact made it essentially an infantryman's war. Nothing was new in the principles of infantry fighting in mountain warfare. Only the forfeits of disregard of those principles were raised, and raised inexorably. Double sentries, easily adjusted to single sentries, always disastrous. The need to dig, never really understood until the first shells arrived in your position, and the first sound you hear after the debris has fallen is the picky, pick, pick of soldiers digging a little bit deeper. There was the care of digging tools. With our young national soldiers, they got so wary on the march that they used to have difficulty in carrying everything. And the first thing they dumped was their digging tools. And in every brag opposition, the last to leave was my sergeant major, who went round all the bushes and came down with a handful of these things and then gave everybody a brassing off. But it's these simple, basic things are what really count.
That's very interesting, because that type of information flows out of every war. Anyway, I think we'd all agree that in spite of the experience of a massed enemy, a very brave mass enemy, well-tried tactical principles, tried and proved in war, served us well. And as you say, it was only when we abandoned them or were slack about them that we got into really deep trouble. General Tom, might I ask you for what strikes you as one of the lessons which we can apply to the future?
I think many of the things have been covered probably. We took part in a large number of withdrawals. We were left high and dry occasionally. No one likes being left high and dry. And I suggest that I hope that later practicing anything, doing something about getting everyone to talk the same language when it comes to withdrawals, so that everybody goes back at the same time, etc.
Yes, flank liaison is not the only key here after all. We discovered that some of our allies had similar or the same terms as ourselves in respect of the withdrawal operation, but that those terms meant something quite different to them. On several occasions, that had very nasty consequences for us. Tony, what about the sapper side?
I'd just like to take the opportunity to make two short points. Something has already been said about the mountainous nature of Korea and of the really appalling weather. Now, perhaps it should be added that there was only one, what we would call in the West, proper road in Korea, and this went from Busan up through Daegu to Seoul. Many of the other roads, once you got off that main road, were really tracks for bullock carts. Now, over that road system, we had to move the apparatus of Western industrial society at war. It was a continual struggle to do this. The point I want to make is that the equipment, which may have been adequate for fighting in the North German plain, was not sufficient for fighting in Korea. We should have had a flexibility to at least double the amount of road making equipment we had, bulldozers, tippers, graders, and so on. That's the first point, namely that equipment for any operation, any expedition, should be suited to the engineer environment of that expedition and not just to perhaps the North German plain. The second point I want to make is a simpler one still, and this is the need for sappers to have a sound knowledge of infantry tactics. Now, it's very easy to say this. It's very easy to pay lip service to it, but to actually achieve it requires continuous effort.
Yes, I think you're unique in the engineers in that the old organisations and equipment, or rather not the old but the well-tried organisation and equipment, served all other arms well except for the sappers. You needed something special because, as you say, the engineer environment was somewhat different and it needs looking at. Perhaps we got a bit better at that when we came to Borneo, though that was not a war but a campaign of quite a different type. Glad you made the point about the infantry training for the engineers, because I remember saying to my CRE when I was a divisional commander that I might have to use his sappers as infantry on one occasion, and he went ashen. Not with fear, but with horror. But how very useful they are at times. I've got 3 points to contribute, if I may, at the end, in the tactical side. The first is what strikes me about the air. Although the North Koreans and subsequently the Chinese had tactical air flying and the ability to prevent us, or at least to attempt to prevent us from getting up over North Korea with very good aircraft like the MiG-19 and so on, the fact is that we had, up to the parallel and often beyond, air supremacy. Yet we were unable to stop the Chinese moving, even moving vehicles by night. Now, I know that we were looking for them by night then by flares dropped. But the fact is, by simple tactical discipline and ruses, they were able to move very freely by night. We also now have image intensification and still more thermal imaging equipment to detect people and vehicles. But my goodness, we are not going to find in, say, Central Europe, Northwest Europe, a single heat environment, and it will be difficult to pick people up, and that includes an enemy trying to pick us up. We mustn't get too frightened, although it's a very important consideration, when we hear that our own air situation will be perhaps inferior, sometimes vastly inferior. We mustn't believe that it means that we've got to stop fighting altogether. Far from it. Human ingenuity can find means at least to diminish the enemy's advantage. Second, command and control. Here's an old lesson. Those commanders of all nationalities who sat back in their headquarters and played military chess had big problems. Those commanders who got out, and you, General Tom, were one of those who did that, you were always out seeing for yourself, at the formation level, knew what was happening, and you were able to take the necessary steps. Military chess is a rotten way to command anybody. Equally, the more senior the general, the less fine-tuning he can do of battles. If you've got strong units, then let them do what it is you've told them to do, and if they're unable to do it for some other reason, call it off and make a new plan. Don't try fine-tuning. The present state of the art of control is coming to that where generals are encouraged to do that because their communications are so good. Finally, fire effect. And this links in what some of my colleagues have said here. General Willoughby, for example, on the old tactical principles. In the defensive battles in particular, what matters in the end is fire effect, destroying the enemy. On the whole, we went for the important tactical positions and accepted gaps rather than trying to string ourselves out and cover every bit of ground. Of course people got through us from time to time, and the Gloucesters at one time had a very unhappy end as a result of that. But most of the other times we were able either to hold firm for a time, like the PPCLI did in that late 27 Brigade battle, and in due course, by hammering the enemy immediately around you, other people will open up a way for you to come back or for them to come back to you. Well, these are a number of lessons which ought to stand the test of time, and perhaps I might end with one other. One that applies to the strategic level and to the tactical level. General MacArthur might have remembered it, and perhaps ought to have remembered it, having served for so long in the Orient. He ought to have remembered it when everything was going for him after that brilliant step forward with the landing at Incheon in September 1950 and his move up to the north. It is an old Japanese adage, And it runs like this. In the moment of victory, tighten your chin string.